Shabbat Shalom. This past week, this Thursday, we commemorated Yom Hashoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day in the Jewish calendar, which is the 27th of Nisan. And just incidentally, if you do not know why we commemorate Yom Hashoah on the 27th of Nisan, there's a very interesting story. It was a whole debate in the Israeli parliament, and actually in the Knesset, there were a number of years where we couldn't have Yom HaShoah because we couldn't have a fixed date because we couldn't make up our minds. The problem was that we wanted to commemorate originally Yom HaShoah on the day the uprising of the Warsaw Ghetto began, which was the first day, the first night of Passover. And the religious element within the Knesset said, no, if we impose a mournful ceremony in the middle of Pesach, it's not going to be okay. So let's do it in the month of Iyar, after Nisan is over, after the holiday of freedom is over. So there was a whole fight that lasted for years. And then we decided to do it after Pesach, but before Iyar, on the 27th of Nisan. It's like the mezuzah being tilted. It's the same type of compromise. But the one thing that I do know is that this is one of the most powerful days in the Jewish calendar. Regardless of the date, it is the one day of the year that we remember really one of the greatest calamities that ever befell our people while on the face of this earth. And as we remember, we also need to understand that memory cannot stand just on its own. If we do not apply memory to our experience today, then memory is worthless. And one of the things that I want to start with this morning is by sharing with you the frustration that I feel, and I hope that many of you feel the same frustration. Every time I hear the word Nazi on TV, my blood just boils. Because we have actually come to a point in time where we are just applying and using the word Nazi left and right, like a slang. Like it means nothing, like anybody could be a Nazi, right? And it's not right. We see it in the news, we say it about other people, some people call that about other people. It's really not okay. Because if you judge history in context, for us, the Nazis are not just a name. The Nazis represent the darkest period in the history of our people and probably of humankind. And so, in that spirit, I want to remind us of some of the things that happened 80 years ago exactly. This year, 2022, of course, is 80 years from 1942. And 1942 was the midst of the tragedy. 80 years ago in January, in Lake Wannsee in Germany, in Berlin, the heads of the Nazi party sat down and plotted the destruction of our people over tea, cookies, dinner, and drinks. 80 years ago, Auschwitz II opened its doors because Auschwitz I was not enough to accommodate the numbers. 80 years ago, in March, the deportations from Lubin to Lvov started, and over 600,000 Jews died as a result of those deportations. 80 years ago in May, the first deportations of the Warsaw Ghetto to Treblinka started. And about 1 million Jews died as a result of those deportations. 80 years ago today in May, Sobibor had already gassed 250,000 Jews. It's important to remember, and to help us remember, and to place this in context, I want to share with you 3 stories this morning. The first one of the stories happened here this Thursday. And it really happened without us planning it. But I'll tell you, a bar mitzvah student came into my office, Seth Mann, who's a great-grandchild of Holocaust survivors. And as I was teaching him how to wrap the tefillin, his mother said to him, Seth, I want you to remember that today is Yom HaShoah. And today you're wrapping tefillin with a rabbi. But my grandparents 80 years ago today, were in Auschwitz. And to tell you the story of the Greenberg family is an incredible story. Gene, who's a member of our congregation, he actually is past president of our congregation, his parents and 2 brothers were deported to Auschwitz. And his 2 brothers were killed. His parents found each other after the end of the war and had Gene and his brother. It's a remarkable story of survival, of resilience. But to have seen Seth wrap the filling in my office on Yom HaShoah really, really brought the message down to earth. That after everything that happened, we need to live Jewish lives of meaning. Jewish lives that are Jewish and will continue to defeat them in every generation. So 2 days ago in my office, it was my own personal victory against the Nazis. And I hope and I wish that all of us during our lifetimes get to experience many of those little victories that are perhaps tiny for us, but if you put them together, they're enormous for our people. Second story. This happened 11 years ago. I found myself with my family in Cambodia. And, I take crazy trips. And when we go to the airport, this guy comes over to us and starts speaking in English. Do you want me to be your guide? And Lee says to me, no, tell him no. So I said to him, how much are you going to charge us? He says, $20 a day, including transportation. I said, you got it. So he was not the greatest of guides. We couldn't understand the word he was saying. But something remarkable happened. The next morning when I woke up early, and I realized I had no currency. And in those days, Cambodia was using American dollars as their currency. So I go to the lobby of the hotel, and I see the guy, and I ask him to take me to a cash machine. He calls the driver, they get me in the van, and 2 minutes later, this man says to me, do you want to go see some girls? I said, no, I want a cash machine, an ATM. You don't want girls, boss? No, I want a cash machine. So they both stop. They turn around and they look at me like I'm crazy. Like, who else comes to look for us at 6 o'clock in the morning with his family sleeping in the room, right? What else would you want? I said, I want a cash machine. And he looks at me and says, what do you do for a living? And I don't know what came over me, and I told him the truth, right? I said, I'm a rabbi. And he looks at me. He says something to the driver in Cambodian. They start driving. Like a minute later, he looks at me again and says, you will understand. Now I think I'm going to die. So we finally get to this deserted field, and we get off the van, and the man says to me, you see this field? I say, yes. My brother and my sister and my parents are here. They were killed by the Khmer Rouge. In this field, underneath us, there's hundreds of thousands of people. And you're Jewish. You understand my pain. This story, even if I wanted to make it up, I couldn't. So he hugs me, and I hug him, and I hug the driver. I don't know these people, right? We're all hugging each other. And literally, if you kick the earth, there's little fragments of bones that come out. So after 20 minutes of this, I said, look, I'm so sorry this happened. He says, your family was killed too? I said, yes. So they took me back to the hotel. And that was the day we were going to see Angkor Wat. And I said to him, you know what, do me a favor. Take me back there with my family. So he takes us back, and we end up in a monastery, a Buddhist monastery, that has a column made of glass with hundreds of skulls in it. Each one of the skulls has a bullet hole. And Ari was too little, but Daniela and Josh are looking at this column, and they're just staring at it, and they say nothing. So I tried to explain to them. We get back in the van, and I said, what did you feel? So Joshua says, well, it's like what happened to us is like all of the other pictures we've always seen. I realized in that moment that something has happened to us as a people. Yes, we educate our children. We tell them about the Shoah. Many of us make the effort to send them on the March of the Living to see the camps. But yet, the message sometimes is not fully conveyed because they see it as history and not as their story. They see it as the history of our people and not as the story of their family. And the further we get away from the epicenter, the worse it's going to get. And I also realized that my children had no empathy for the suffering of others beyond their own suffering. Yes, they were sad, but this was unto us too. So I shouldn't be so sad for them because they killed us too. I was really moved to tears by this, but tears of shame. And it's perhaps the biggest education I've gotten on understanding the Shoah in my entire life. Story number 3. This is from Greece. And I heard this story in Auschwitz 3 years ago. There's a little island among the Greek islands called Zakynthos. And Zakynthos during the war had a population of 253 Jews. When the Nazis got there, they captured the mayor of the city in 1944, Lucas Carroll. And they told him he had to give up the Jews. So he said, give me 24 hours. And he went to the Greek Orthodox Bishop Chrysostomos. And they both showed up to the Nazis the next day with a list. And in that list, there were only 2 names. The name of the mayor and the name of the bishop. And they said, these are our Jews. Take us. So the Nazis didn't know what to do. And they said, if you take the Jews, you take us with them, and you take the entire island. The next day, the Nazis received a list with all of the names of every single person that lived in the island. And you know what happened? There's a legend that Bishop Chrysostomos actually contacted Hitler. And there was a record of this. But in 1953, there was an earthquake on the island, and all of the records were buried in the rubble. There was a fire, everything was burned. Incidentally, the first ship to arrive with aid to that island was a ship from the Israeli Navy. And as I tell the story, I get chills because they understood that they had to see and love others beyond themselves, which is one of the things that we pledged we would always do. We said never again. And I couldn't even get my children to understand how important that place that we were standing at was. And it was not in Europe, it was in Asia. And you know, the worst part of all of this, when hundreds of thousands of Cambodians were killed by the Khmer Rouge, at the exact same time, the United Nations in New York was debating whether Zionism was racism. This is what the world rather occupy itself instead of dealing with the issues that it has to deal with. I want to share with you, to end, 2 thoughts. One from Gerda Weissman-Klein, who actually is connected powerfully to this community. Her daughter lives here. She died a couple of months ago at the age of 94. She wrote beautiful books about the Shoah and her experience. And there's a story that she tells when her best friend Ilsa and her were in a march, one of the death marches. And Ilsa, the only thing she had left was a cranberry. And she had it in her pocket. And Gerda was dying of hunger. And Ilse turned around and gave her the cranberry. Gerda wrote, imagine living in a world where your only possession, the last thing you have, is a cranberry. And you give it to your friend who's starving out of love. She also said that survival is both an exalted privilege and a painful, unbearable burden. And the burden comes from surviving and knowing that it's your responsibility, that this can never happen again. And when you look at the world that doesn't listen, then you know what a burden means. Franz Rosenzweig once wrote that we are commanded to love the world. But the problem with this command is that when we try to love the world, our eyes trick us. And the only thing that we could see are our loved ones and the people standing next to us. Because that's sometimes the limit of our love. And that's what we have to pray, to save our souls from bad eyesight, so that God can empower us to have vision and we can see beyond our loved ones, beyond our neighbors, and far, far away, to love people who we've never met, to love people who are not like us, to love people that are different than us, and to love people that are even perhaps at some point in time our enemies. Every concentration camp guard in Auschwitz was Ukrainian. Ivan the Terrible was born in Kiev. I've said this 1,000 times. Yet, now, what's happening in Ukraine cannot go on. And we have to speak up. This is not a war for territory. Look at what we're watching on TV. It's not another Shoah, but it's genocide for sure. Yes, it was Ukrainians who drove the trucks, who took family members of mine to Babi Yar. But you know what? I pray, like Rosenzweig said, that God gives me the vision to see beyond that. So I can love and I can say, never again, and I really mean it. And that we can teach our children, really teach our children, that when a human being suffers, it doesn't matter their sexuality, their color, their race, where they come from, how they eat, how they dress. When one of us suffers, our common humanity has to cry out and say, no more. That's what never again actually means. As we move me'afela le'ora, from darkness to the light that comes next week with Yom Ha'atzmaut, it is my prayer that all of us pray for vision, pray for understanding, for love, and pray for the ability to cry for others. Shabbat Shalom u'mevorach. May I please ask us to rise, page 183. We're going to continue with Kaddish